Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting the European Youth Forum to come here to also share our views. The European Youth Forum is an umbrella for youth organizations at the European level, and we advocate the views of young people, especially regarding European issues and European policies. One of the things that we have been most concerned with when it comes to young people in Europe and citizenship, what we have started to explore is their participation in the political process. We know that over time, young people are the age group, and in this age group I refer to young people up to the age of 24, that are actually, in most member states, the least likely age group to turn out to vote. And this has been something which is historically true in most countries. But what has happened recently is that the gap between generations in terms of participation has started to increase. So young people over time have become less likely as an age group to participate in a political process as measured by, for example, voter turnout, their participation in political organizations, or their engagement with politicians and political campaigns, etc. And that what concerns us in the European Youth Forum is true also at the European Union level, at the European Parliament elections. So in the recent elections, the age group until 24, only 28% of that age group on average voted, whereas it was much higher in total, around 41%. What we know as well is it's true in almost every single member state. There were only 3 countries that bucked the trend. They were Belgium and Luxembourg. Those countries have mandatory or compulsory voting, and the difference there was very small between age groups. And then there was Sweden. And Sweden was where there was a big difference, where young people were actually most likely to vote. So we have started to look into, so what does this tell us, this, as was referred to before as well, absenteeism from political decision-making. And voter turnout is just one measure where we see it manifested. And this is actually contrasted when it comes to the European issues by a number of studies, including the standard Eurostat surveys or the Eurobarometer surveys that look at the views of citizens towards the EU, where actually the same age group is most positive towards the European Union. They see themselves more likely as Europeans, and they also see value in being part of Europe. And they also see that Europe as a political entity has impact on their lives more likely than other age groups. So there is this kind of a disconnect between, let's say, these figures. So we started to look into what are the overall causes that young people do not participate. And there we see that it's very clearly linked with, well, we have to admit there is no European level elections, so to say. There's still quite national debates that happen. So it's very much still to do with how young people engage at their national level in general. So the problem when we want to fix the problem of political participation at the European level, we cannot do that without addressing the national level. And there we see what concerns young people is that they don't see that issues that are of their interest are being debated at a political level. So in the campaigns or in the promises being made to the electorate, young people are not being addressed. There are also often very few young people that can even run in the elections. So there is this kind of distance. And of course that is not true everywhere. But even I come from Estonia, and before as well, when we had a small conversation, that Estonia is one of the, I don't know how you phrase it exactly, but Estonia has one of the youngest leaderships in the EU when it comes to politicians. Our Prime Minister is 34 years of age. The Minister for Education, Culture and Youth is younger than I am. He is 27. and a number of other young ministers. And this is not true only now, this has happened in the past as well. But even in those cases, we don't see that it has a major impact on other young people actually participating in the political decision making. So it's rather a series of questions around the interest of young people and whether the political system addresses that. And there are some notable examples. Most recently, Scottish referendum was mentioned, where also young people aged 16 to 17 were allowed to vote, and where we saw that they were among one of the most informed participants in this referendum. And it was largely due to the fact that there was a great role in Scotland in schools. The schools were given a specific task to prepare these new voters, this new age group, so to say, to take an informed decision, so that it wouldn't be a decision just based on emotions, but they would really consider both options that were presented to vote yes or no. And they were also then, the overall turnout was very high, but the young people were actually in Scotland most likely to turn out. And of course you can have a debate about the referendum and its merits, but what you can say is that the campaign, in a way, did get young people to participate. We need to look more closer in those cases, or why in Sweden young people turn out more. But when it comes to education and the role of education, what is there often... It's true to say that we need to look at what is being taught at schools, but often what is more important to also look at is how the teaching is delivered. We might incorporate citizenship education or European citizenship into the curricula, and we might ask that to be done at all different national levels, and it will take its time, even technically, to get it there. But the real difference is that how do we get to discussing these different European realities? How do we make sure that young people of today and tomorrow empathize with problems of other people, and not only in other countries, but also within their own countries, other social groups, etc. Because that is a growing concern in all European countries, that you have more xenophobia, etc. So these things are not necessarily decoupled. But so the question of how are we teaching is relevant from the point of view, are we teaching our young people, and not only young people, because the colleges and universities also engage in lifelong learning, to have a critical mindset. And that is often something which we now see more and more that is forgotten, because the predominant discussions when it comes to education these days are about the utilitarian value of education for the economy. And that is often that we need, to have, so the short-term view that we need skills is very much dominating over some of the other aspects that are more values-related and go beyond the skills. So we also talk about skills for citizenship, which is essential. But in terms of political engagement, you need to also back that up with also a mindset and a tradition of critical reflection. So that is often something which is being cut in the national curricula. And this reminds me of a very interesting book I've read a couple of years ago by Martha Nussbaum. She's an American scholar, though, but she's been looking at exactly this. She's been writing on many other issues as well, but she has a book called The Silent Crisis. And she's saying that all across the world, this is happening quite silently, that arts and humanities are cut out as a result of education reform at all different levels of education. And this is exactly where a lot of this creativity and critical mindset is being developed, or was the tradition in many universities or schools. And that this is actually the true crisis that we're facing. We might have an economic crisis still ongoing, but if we're talking from a perspective of citizenship, that is probably one of the most important questions, looking also at the fact that we cannot add up things in curricula, and we might need to have actually a more comprehensive view of what is being taught and how it is being taught at schools. So a more student-centered approach is needed from this point of view. And the second question that or issue that I wanted to raise when it comes to Europe and why young people don't also participate, and that doesn't only apply to young people, is this question of, I was reading an interesting article recently on opendemocracy.net, which is a news website basically. The title of that article read, "Is it a question of narrative or substance for Europe's future?" And I think we shouldn't belittle of what Europe is doing well in terms of also citizenship, for example, the Erasmus Plus programs, citizenship programs, etc., in terms of trying to bridge those gaps. But the reality is that in mostly the things that matter to people, welfare, police, schools, local government, they are decided within the national political system. So the question is whether you have a political debate there or not is one of relevance, but it is still an issue of substance, most likely, why people will not engage or will not see themselves as European citizens, because the Europe, although it might have a large macro influence at our own political systems, it still actually doesn't transfer those realities to the ground immediately. So that is the concern, is that, you know, it's very even if you want to engage, the options that are available to you as a European citizen, even in those programs, are still very limited because the resources at the European level are very limited. Erasmus Plus program can only reach a minority of students. If we take up the aim of saying that everybody should go, yes, that's maybe a different case. So we shouldn't belittle what Europe is doing, but perhaps we should be a bit more realistic what Europe can promise to its citizens, because it's very easy to say that politicians are saying that Europe is delivering on this program, and then because, I mean, we want to make it sound good, we make it sound much bigger than it really is. And one example I can clearly bring from the point of view of young people, and as a concluding remark as well, is, for example, the youth guarantee. We're all very much concerned with youth unemployment, which is quite high, especially in a number of member states. So at European level, we adopted this kind of an approach, recommendation to governments, but also some funds from Europe, around some 10 billion euros or more, with the Youth Guarantee and the Youth Employment Initiative. And the promise is, the policy is that within 4 months of graduation or becoming unemployed, a young person should be offered a traineeship or internship or further education or a proper employment opportunity. So it's a public program that should basically reach to the young people and to prevent them from becoming inactive in the labor market. And if you consider this policy promise, which is now being heralded at all different member states, saying that this is something that comes from Europe, whereas in fact, the only way of delivering it is if member states contribute much more, because 10 billion euros from the European level does not even get us near to what is needed. 10 billion euros for 2 years, whereas we would need something like 50 for each year to be able to deliver on this. So it's a question of whether Europe is sometimes also perhaps it's doing the right things, but also in terms of, are we communicating this in a realistic way so that we don't disappoint the people that are part of this. So there is, of course, this big political gap, and young people are seeing that as well. So although they see, they're the age group most likely to see that Europe has impact, they still know that whether they participate or not in the European elections, it's going to actually make a rather small difference. So I think we have to consider these very practical issues from citizens' point of view as well, when it comes to whether they would engage in a political discourse or not. And they will do that more likely if it directly addresses the issues. And most people probably will see that Europe cannot directly address their issues, perhaps indirectly, but there as well you have a big problem with decision making, that leaders gather in a room, they make decisions. Within the room, they might all agree, and when they come out, regardless of what was their original position of negotiation and what the outcome was, each and every leader comes to their own government, their own parliament, their own citizens, saying that we won that debate. And they don't actually transfer the message which was commonly agreed. They're just saying that we won at the European level. So there's also a lot of misinformation and disinformation about the European level issues. So this is something what we need. It's not necessarily to only provide the basics about what the EU is and how it functions, but it's also important to talk really about the substantive policy issues and to see, I would very much agree, where the differences are, and to say that sometimes at the national level, well, not sometimes, but more often so, the political discourse is actually giving out information that is factually completely incorrect. And I think we need to very actively combat that. Thank you very much.